depending on who you ask, this is kind of the anthropological argument, the moral argument. There's various names for it. We're going to focus on the idea of morality as an argument in and of itself for the existence of God and for the existence of the character of God to an extent, which we'll expand on that more here soon. As we get started, let's start off with this question. Does everyone agree that there is an objective standard of right and wrong? And let me clarify, we're not saying does everyone agree there's an objective standard in the sense that like, oh, there's right and wrong from God, the Bible. That's not what we're talking about. Does everyone agree there's an objective standard of right and wrong? Chris? Okay. Explain. Okay. Okay. So we see certainly, if you come from a standpoint of believing in God, which of course we do, but we're talking about everyone here. On the one hand, everyone has kind of this, okay, well, there's certain things that I don't think are right. We're going to come back to that. At least at face value, though, does everyone in our world today believe there is an objective standard of right and wrong? At the very least, there are many who claim not to believe there is. Now, toward the end of our class tonight, we're going to discuss why even they aren't really consistent in their statement versus how they actually live their lives, but we can at least all agree that it's not correct, but there are many people in our world who argue there is no such thing as an objective standard of right and wrong. In other words, things that are just inherently right or inherently wrong to do. You mentioned murder. There are even those who would go so far as to say something like murder actually isn't inherently wrong given certain circumstances, this and that and the other. Again, we'll come back to why even they still usually operate off of a standard. I want us to consider, though, as we're looking through this, I want us to consider this quotation from the third iteration of the Humanist Manifesto. If you're familiar a little bit with the Humanist Manifesto, basically this is just a statement of beliefs. It's kind of like their creed, if you will, because they do consider themselves a religious organization, interestingly enough. Many who claim some form of humanism, oftentimes they act appalled when we call them a religion, and yet the Humanist Association of America and various other places actually describe themselves as a religious group. Nonetheless, this functions kind of like their creed, and they've had 3 different ones. The latest one was published in 2003. Notice one of their statements. Ethical values are derived from human need and interest as tested by experience. Humanists ground values in human welfare shaped by human circumstances, interests, concerns, extended to the global ecosystem and beyond. We are committed to treating each person as having inherent worth and dignity and to making informed choices in a context of freedom, consonant with responsibility. Now, reading that long jumble of words, whenever we just give that kind of a cursory glance, just read through it, okay, well, I like the idea of valuing human welfare. I like the idea of helping people to be treated with inherent worth and dignity, things like that. But as we read through this, hopefully we understand what they're actually saying here. They're kind of making it a little more complicated than it has to be. Yes? Inherent. Okay, good. We're going to, again, come back to that somewhat, but let's go and talk about it a little bit. Inherent worth and dignity. They do not say mankind as a whole is inherently worthwhile and therefore we need to try and perpetuate our species. That is part of what they believe, but notice, they say every individual person has inherent worth and dignity. Well, what is that if not a statement of values? We believe this is true. We believe this is right. Yes, Chris? Yes. Okay. Uh, they are making a statement as people who also very clearly in this very same manifesto argue for naturalistic evolution from slime, et cetera, and yet they're saying we still have inherent worth and dignity, but why, Steve? Yes. Yes, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. Yes, very good. So they're basing all of this on human reason. They're putting humans at the pinnacle. I want us to understand, though, especially with this specific statement, I want us to understand what they're doing here. Notice values, ethical values, meaning morals, right? Those are derived by need and interest tested by experience, shaped by circumstances, interests, concerns. In other words, none of them are inherent. For our discussion tonight, this is an explicit denial of the idea that morality is anything other than an evolution within what they would claim is an evolved, intelligent species, human beings. There is nothing inherent except for just this simply developed as part of what is going on here. That's their claim. I want us to start off with this because, again, our whole point tonight is to try and understand the concept of morality as it can be used to help us understand the reality of God, God's character, His existence, all these kinds of things. So we're trying to look at the other side and get a sense of, here's the claim. The claim is morality is a human invention. We came up with it because of our various experiences. We came to the conclusion, or more our half-ape ancestors, came to the conclusion that being moral is more advantageous to me than being immoral. And even that is a constantly moving target. There is no such thing as a consistent, objective standard of morality, even within that evolved framework. That's the argument. Of course, I want to give us some just scriptural insights as we move through here. The entire premise of it being a human invention, by necessity, means that we are the standard of right and wrong, that we know what is best for ourselves as human beings. In fact, if you read through the whole manifesto, that actually is the premise of humanism itself, that we as human beings are in a unique place to solve our own problems. God has something different to say. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And we only have to look, quite frankly, at our own lives, much less at the lives of those around us, to recognize how many times we've done something, oh yeah, this is the right decision. No. No, this was a terrible decision. Why did I make this decision? What did I just do? Right? And yet, that's the whole premise behind this. So, let's first consider culture. What does culture indicate about objective standards of right and wrong? In other words, as we look not only at our own culture, but at cultures around the world, both past and present, is there anything that, as we just study culture, can give us insight into how right and wrong work? Okay. Okay, good. So there is certainly a fluidity in culture. By no means is culture a good objective standard, certainly. Anything else? Yes, Nick? Hmm. Okay, good, good. So we have a do's and don'ts, Nick said, and yet we still have this idea of, okay, there's things that we don't do, but there's also things that we go beyond just not doing to actually do for other people. And let's think about that for just a second. Is there any culture, we understand the list itself is different culture to culture. Is there any culture that doesn't have some sense of there are things you should do and things you shouldn't do? They all have that basic concept. Now, the atheist or the humanist or whoever might say, well, yeah, but that proves our point. Maybe they think there are things that we should do and things that we shouldn't do, but that's so fluid, that changes from culture to culture. That's no evidence at all. Well, we're building a case, so let's be patient. Culture, in general, yes, is very fluid, but every one of them has basic standards. Now, let's go back to what Chris mentioned a moment ago. Murder. Are there cultures, past and present, quite frankly, that justify various forms of murder as at the very least acceptable? Oh, of course. Is there a culture, generally speaking, that elevates something like murder to the level of a virtue? Well, okay. In the sense of warfare, in the sense of we must, defeat our enemies. Yes, Steve? Okay. Okay. Mhm. Okay, good, good. There are aspects where we redefine certain things and is considered moral. But how many abortionists will agree that abortion is the murder of a child? Very few will accept that wording. They have to reword it. Why would they feel the necessity to reword it? Now, there are a few who will just own it, right? But very few like that wording. There's a reason why there are people who call themselves pro-life, not pro-murder, right? Yes, sir. Okay, which implies something, doesn't it? Even for those who are defining this as morally not just okay, but I agree with you, Steve, morally virtuous, even, at the very least, to agree with the standpoint, they've still got to shift the definitions because they don't want to be referred to as murderers. How about something else? How about the idea, let's say, of being completely untrustworthy, completely undependable? Are there cultures that allow for such things in certain circumstances? Oh, absolutely. Is there any culture that is the ideal to strive for? That is who you should be. If you are the best possible person, you are a person who no one can trust. Now, again, maybe we can find some outlier little places where maybe there's a sense of it, but generally speaking, culturally even, with all the fluidity that goes along with culture, there are certain things that are just basically understood to be moral or immoral as opposed to simply making up the rules as we go, if you will. This is most obvious, I would maintain at least, with children. If you see children playing on a playground or anywhere, they have something, some toy, some game that they're playing. One kid comes and snatches something out of another child's hand while everyone was having fun. All of a sudden, there's a meltdown. All of a sudden, people are throwing fits. And what does the child who had that toy taken from them say? What is their objection? It's not fair. Where'd that come from? How do they know that some things are fair and just and right and other things aren't? Now, I'm not suggesting that children have a perfectly formed conscience and they know all of right from wrong. Any of you who are parents can very quickly tell us that that's not necessarily the case. And yet there is still an inherent sense, maybe not of what is right and what is wrong, but the concept that there is right and wrong, that there are things that are fair and just and other things that are not. Again, the standard may be skewed. It is quite unjust of you parents to deny ice cream as dinner every night. How dare you? But we understand nonetheless the concept that even children grasp the basic idea there must be something that defines right, fair, just, and something that does not. Think about, and I want to actually read a little more of the context of this. I have this up here, so if you want to turn to Romans 2. But I want to give us some context of what Paul is doing here in Romans chapter 2. Paul is writing to the church in Rome, which essentially, if we understand the setting correctly, there was a phase of history where where Jews were ejected from Roman territory, not like the Roman Empire territory, like the city of Rome, that territory. They were not allowed to live within city limits for a time. Well, by that time, Christianity had spread to Rome. Jews are now asked to leave. Well, many of these Jews have now become Christians. But not everyone who was a Christian in Rome was a Jew. The Gentile Christians were a minority. But while the Jews are gone for just a few years, and then eventually the Romans allow them back into Rome, the church in Rome continues to grow. Now, all of a sudden, the Jews, the Jewish Christians specifically, they come back and they find that they're no longer the majority. At the very least, it's a fairly even split. If not, they're now outnumbered by the Gentile Christians. That creates some difficulties, which is a big part of the context of why Romans was written by Paul. He starts off in chapter 1 by talking about the Gentiles, by saying, think about how the Gentiles used to live, how godless they used to be, all these things. And we're pretty familiar, oftentimes, with chapter 1. It talks about how God's invisible attributes are clearly seen in the things that are made. They're without excuse, because at the very least, those basic fundamental concepts of God are visible without direct revelation. And then in chapter 2, he flips the script, because you can just hear those Jewish Christians who have come back into Rome and are hearing Paul light into the Gentiles. Oh, get him, Paul. Yeah, you tell him, Paul. Paul turns around, and you are inexcusable as well, you who judge, Jews, because in condemning others, you also condemn yourself. You are guilty of the same things. Yes, Chris? Who? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Yes. It is. It is. So, Chris said that even many atheists who are willing to be honest about the ramifications of their belief admit that there is no objective foundation for any kind of right and wrong or standard of morality. Paul in Romans 2, he notes that even though oftentimes the Jews were in a much better position before Christ to understand what they should do morally, he says the Gentiles still, because of what he talks about, of seeing the invisible attributes of God, the Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature, do things that the law requires. They then are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. In other words, he's saying, even without the direct revelation of God, Gentiles who did not know anything directly about Yahweh from, for example, the Old Testament scriptures, still had a basic concept that there was right and there was wrong, that there was a standard. That's what he's talking about when he says law here. By nature, they do what the law requires. In other words, from purely a cultural standpoint, it is clear that every human culture, past and present, has always had at least some sense of a concept of right and wrong. Differed on the details, and certainly compromised on what they allowed, but then what do we expect? Because what is the human problem that we all face? Well, it's sin. What does sin do? Sin corrupts morality. Sin corrupts the character that we should be trying to emulate of God within ourselves, so that instead of emulating God's character, our character becomes corrupted when we give in to sin. That being said, even when we are willing to make laws to establish standards that allow us to do things that we really know we shouldn't do, there's still a standard of some kind that we feel like we have to put in place. Interesting. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yes and no. In one sense, I agree with you. Most people are not willing to go this far with it. I would say we're, at least in our society, very close to a majority who is willing to pay lip service to it. In the sense that until we actually boil it down, it's kind of nice to be able to say, well, we can agree to disagree. Well, there's really, who's to say what's truly right and what's wrong? We're close in our society to most people paying lip service to that. Now, as we're going to see in a moment, very few people live that way. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that very few people are actually willing to live out the ramifications of that in everyday life. But people more and more are accepting the concept and paying lip service to the concept of it because it's advantageous. Mm. Yes. Oh, yes. Yep. Yeah. Yes. And that uncertainty, as we've mentioned before, the uncertainty that is created when a society accepts the idea, at least say they accept the idea, that law, that standards are subjective, the uncertainty that's created, do you ever wonder why things like anxiety and depression and things like that are on the rise? Now, there's many reasons, and some of that's biological, don't get me wrong. But a lot of that is caused when, from a very early age, you are taught, whether explicitly or simply implicitly, that there is no real security, that nothing is stable, that nothing is sacred, that nothing is actually reliable. And that's where we are and have been for a little while. But to go back to your earlier point, what civilizations last? You mentioned the Romans. The measure of Rome was law. That was one of the main things that set Rome apart. But Rome's not the only one. Why was it? Let's go back to the Old Testament for a second. Why was it that Daniel was thrown into the lion's den? Petty jealousy between politicians, right? But the king loved him. The king had no desire to throw him in the lion's den. Why was he thrown in anyway? Well, somebody had the power to do it. But why was he thrown in even though the king didn't want to do it? Because the king should have had the ultimate say, right? The law of the Persians could not be broken. Once a law was made under the Persian cultural system, it was not allowed to be broken. This is the same reason why in the book of Esther, the law saying, go out and exterminate the Jews, if you actually read the text, the law is not revoked. Instead, another law is made saying, yeah, it's still legal for you on this day to kill Jews, but we're going to make a new law that says not only is it legal for them to defend themselves, but we're going to reward people who fight for them. Why? The Persians had set up a system elevating law even above the wishes of the king himself. And we could go on and on and on and on of examples of civilizations that valued law and order. There's a reason why we put those two together. Law and order. Dun, dun, oh, sorry. We value that so much. There's a reason why. It's because they recognize that without some sort of objective standard, everything falls apart. Now again, the atheists would be quick to jump in. That's not an objective standard. Human beings came up with that law. Okay, sure. Let's talk about a law that human beings did come up with. You might be familiar with this picture. This is a picture of a camp operating in the 40s, give or take, in the area controlled by Nazi Germany. I want to read to you a statement. This is part of a very long opening statement made by Robert H. Jackson in the Nuremberg trials in 1945. He says, "The charter of this tribunal evidences a faith that the law is not only to govern the conduct of little men, in other words, the average person in any country, but that even rulers are, as Lord Chief Justice Coke put it to King James, under God and the law. The United States believe that the law long has afforded standards by which a judicial hearing could be conducted, to which would make sure that we punish only the right men and for the right reasons." Again, kind of flowery language. Let's boil it down. He's saying there is law that goes beyond the laws that governments make. If you are an officer in Nazi Germany, you are ordered to construct and run a camp housing Jews and various other undesirables and disposing of them. Are you following, to the letter, the law of your land, if you comply? Is there any other law by human standards that it has jurisdiction over you under that circumstance? Until the fall of Nazi Germany and its government, no. The only jurisdiction that any human law has over you is the jurisdiction of the Nazi government at the time. The Nuremberg trials could only function if they recognized that there must be a law greater than any human law to which we appeal to recognize that those who would commit such horrible acts against humanity can be punished under such law. And that's essentially what Robert Jackson is stating here, is that if we don't allow for the existence of such a law, any sovereign nation can create horrific laws like these, or worse, if we could imagine worse, and no one could say they were wrong because they are following the laws that their government, their society has established and put in place. This is one of the interesting things. The atheists often try to throw in the face of Christians the so-called problem of evil. That is, how could a God who is both all-powerful and all-loving allow evil in the world? Now, there are many biblical answers to that. There are also many that aren't actually good, so I encourage you, whenever you say that, of course we don't have time tonight, I encourage you to discern between what the Bible actually says and what it doesn't say, because many have tried to defend Scripture and in doing so made poor arguments. That being said, the atheists try to throw that at us. I think one of the easiest responses, how could a good, all-powerful, loving God do this? How could he tolerate evil? How could he not stamp it out? The response is, well, how would you define evil? Because without God, you can't. And then you throw it back at them. How can I say that the events that took place under Nazi Germany are immoral? They don't have a solid answer to that. Now, they'll try and attempt answers. Yes, yes. Good, good. I'm glad you bring that up. Essentially, what they did is they tried to create a human-made framework by which all nations would then be subject to this law, which is simultaneously a recognition that we need something more than a single sovereign entity, but at the same time also an attempt to make a human version of what God has already put in place, because we don't want to go by that. Good point. Yes, Steve? I'm sure. Yes. Yeah. 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 And as you said, the seeds for this in our society, which we see this throughout history in many societies, seeds for that, for what we're seeing now, were sown long ago. This is not something that just cropped up overnight. We're just seeing it happen overnight. Ultimately, I would argue that Israel during the Judges gives us this exact sense of what we're seeing now. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's the standard that most people appeal to in our society today. Ultimately, you don't have a right to tell me what to do. I have my truth. I have my standard of right and wrong. That's the only thing I should be amenable to. Now, yeah. Hmm. Yes, yes. Hmm. Yes. It is an end justifies the means. You mentioned lying and these other things. Eh, the ways in which we try and twist it is we try and create an end justifies the means system, but even that still can't dispense with the basic concept that there must be some kind of aspect of right and aspect of wrong. Uh, I want us to think about this in the context of what we talked about a few weeks ago with philosophical apologetics. Remember what we said. An idea, just like any other phenomenon, whether physical or not, an idea cannot pop into existence from nothing. Ideas, just like anything else, have to come from somewhere. We consider, when we're thinking about ourselves, we talked about like creating a mythical creature, right? You just put pieces together from all sorts of things that you've seen or are familiar with. And so we talked about that then in terms of the very concept of spirit, or the very concept of all these other things. Well, right and wrong, the concept that there is a standard of right and wrong that all are responsible to follow. Where did that come from? Now, the atheist would argue this is a pragmatic measure. That is, this is a very practical thing, right? We're going to follow this standard of right and wrong because if we all do certain things, we all benefit. And so it's really for our mutual benefit. Okay. Anybody know what this is? You might not be able to read it on the screen. Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. I really don't know. Y'all help me out if I'm really racking my brain for any society, past, present, or I imagine the future, that doesn't in some way respect the idea of sacrificing your life for other people. Now, I understand in certain contexts, for example, certain wars like the Vietnam War and things like that, people despise the soldiers because of various reasons. But I'm talking about in general, the concept of sacrificing yourself for someone else, either to protect them or for some other worthy cause. I am not aware of any culture that doesn't find that virtuous. And most cultures actually go to great lengths and great expense to venerate people who sacrifice for others, whether it's for the country as a whole in the armed forces, or whether it's for individuals in various ways. Where does that come from? Not just the sacrifice itself and the idea that sacrificing is virtuous. That's not mutually beneficial in a purely practical sense, given an evolutionary framework. What is the basic standard of how you progress evolution? Well, that's how you would evaluate morals, but the basic standard by which you progress evolution is survival of the fittest. It's, I am going to do my best to survive. It's, I am going to try to climb the food chain. The basic premise of evolution is ultimately focused on all these other species, all these other entities can fall by the wayside. I am doing my best to progress. I am doing my best to pass on my genetic material. I am doing my best to improve and survive. How is that compatible with valuing self-sacrifice for others? Now, maybe if someone else sacrifices for me, sure. But that's not what we're talking about. Notice, again, I want to come back and look at this just a little bit more. We already mentioned the very nature of what they're saying here. We are committed to treating each person as having inherent worth and dignity. Why? That should be the reason why, right? But these are atheists who deny anything about God. Why do human beings, each individual human being, why do they have worth and dignity? If they had said humanity as a whole, maybe we could make an argument, especially from an evolutionary point of view. Our species needs to continue, therefore we need morality so that our species can continue as a whole, because in the grand scheme of things, being moral, as Steve brought out earlier, being moral, being orderly, it benefits society as a whole. Maybe we could make that argument. But how can you make an argument that it is inherently moral to give worth and dignity to every individual human being. In fact, when you actually look at how humanism tends to operate, how would humanism dictate that we treat those who act against their values? Well, a big part of how they would argue for that is they need to be silenced. They need to be shut down because they're hurting humanity as a whole. Well, what happened to the inherent worth of the individual in that? Not to mention, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that now we talk about individual people in their own daily life. Nothing is inherently moral or immoral. So, let's pay people based on that standard. Employers, there is nothing moral or immoral about how much or how little you want to pay your workers, no matter how well they do, no matter how much they do for you. How many writers for humanist publications you think would go along with that logic? But how could they argue against it? Because what's moral or immoral? Oh, well, we're trying to do these things to benefit mankind, so we should... No. Because how do you even know that that in of itself is moral? In fact, how could we even argue, based purely from a humanistic framework, that the survival of mankind is inherently morally good? I mean, really, if you look at a lot of the proposals, both from an evolutionary and also an ecological point of view, you actually find a lot of people coming very close to saying that humanity is a cancer that's hurting the planet and needs to be removed. So where does us having inherent worth and dignity come in? Nick? Responsibility. And why? Why? On what basis do I have any responsibility? Well, because it benefits mankind. Why is that good? Well, because it benefits everyone in it. And why is that good? Ultimately, what recourse do they have? But either, well, that's what I am as a human, therefore I want myself and my fellow human beings to succeed, or just, it is because it is. There's no basis. There's no standard. There's no reason to base these arguments on once you remove God out of the picture. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. Yes, absolutely. If, as Jesus said, I'm supposed to treat other people the way that I should be treated, and this goes back to your point, David, the only reason that I could found something like that on is if, in fact, each human being has inherent worth and dignity. But there has to be a reason why they have inherent worth and dignity. And as you said, the only reason is if we're made in the image of God. There's no basis that we can found that belief on otherwise. And that's where ultimately we come back to God being the standard. God giving us the insight that this is, in fact, how we should live, who we are, who we should be. As the psalmist says, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. God is the one who helps us understand not only that there is right and wrong, even just God's creation tells us that by itself, but helps us understand what that looks like, how I should live because of that. It is. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 And the reason it's important to talk about it is because, as we said, this is what our society is being inundated with. They may not live it out to its full ramifications, most people. But this is what people are hearing constantly. There is no objective morality. That's why by our example and by our words, not only do we have to share the information, but we have to use the opportunity. You have uncertainty. You have instability. You're searching for something. Let me show you a better way. Let me show you what you don't know you're looking for. Not everyone will listen, but that's our opportunity. Even those who deny the existence of right and wrong still practice some form of it. And I would argue even they can't explain where that comes from. Just in everyday life. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I hate to admit this, there are people who don't believe in God that are more moral in terms of just their actions than some people I know that do believe in God. But they don't have a reason they can give, which again is an opportunity. Clearly, you know you need to be doing right and avoiding wrong. Can I help you understand why you feel so strongly that that's how you need to live? We're out of time. I hope this has been helpful as we're going through this. We're going to have, at the end of the month, we're going to have a couple of subs in here for this. So next week will be the last time I'm teaching, and we're going to go over one other concept that's kind of unique, but I think it'll be fun. Thank you all so much.